So next up, I would like to talk about narration. And narration, the deal with it in games is that how the story is experienced, as with game systems, is often a matter of relationships between objects and entities. Again, this is a reference back to the game mechanics lecture where we were talking about objects and relationships and behaviors. And the most common relationships explored are those between characters, especially in dramatic arches or dramatic stories. But it doesn't need to be characters, and in games we're more often seeing themes represented by a society or a world around the character. A character might be struggling to change the world or fit into the world or escape the oppressive surroundings. So even if, regardless if it's a character or a world, this means that there is a conflict between two carriers of an ideology or an idea. And in the most basic of stories, usually used in games, we were just talking about some kind of good knight versus bad knight, and they fight it out, and the player represents the good. And when we're talking about good knights and bad knights, we're usually talking about a protagonist and an antagonist. So in our example before, we experimented with changing the perspective of the story, or the narration rather. So the protagonist is generally the character whose perspective through which we are experiencing the story, which means that whoever is telling the story becomes the protagonist. And this is most commonly the hero in our stories. The antagonists are generally the opposition, the final boss, and in this example, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are heroes, and Krang is the sort of big bad, or Shredder is basically the final boss, but Krang is even more final than Shredder. So Krang is the big bad hiding behind the Shredder. We're not always talking about a good hero, a hero that is immediately likable. We have complicated examples, as in Bester's The Stars Are My Destination, as well as Donaldson's Gap Cycle, Dark and Hungry God Arises, two recommended works of fiction, especially in terms of portraying anti-heroes. These are usually rather complex affairs. It's about characters who have immoral or non-likable traits, but who, through their actions and through us getting to know them more, prove that they do have a human side, and there might be a reasoning behind their immoral behavior, which means that we'll start to empathize with them and perhaps feel pity for them, etc. So let's look at some of the archetypal characters. We have a supporting cast in addition to the protagonist and the antagonist. We sometimes know them as sidekicks. One famous sidekick is Alex from Half-Life 2. Through the entirety of Half-Life 1, Gordon Freeman is entirely silent. Gordon Freeman is the hero of Half-Life, and you play this character who never utters a word. And in Half-Life 2, Gordon is still completely silent, but what Valve did was that they added Alex as a mirror that is reflecting Gordon Freeman and providing some reaction to your behavior and providing commentary on the world around you. So rather than have the main character talk, we're using the sidekick to reflect the hero's traits or properties. This is used in innumerable amounts of works of fiction and drama, where we see characters that are often quite simple or flat, but have a single defining trait, because that trait helps reflect something back on the hero. So in the case of Toad in the Super Mario Brother games, Toad is plays a number of different roles in these games, but is often rescued, is often a coward, or sometimes a shopkeeper that has a plethora of items that could help you, but for some very absurd reason, he will only let you have one of these items, or one extra life, even though Toad seems to have a number of them on hand. So he's some weird, greedy figure as well. But his most defining trait is usually in the modern games that he is a coward, which in turn helps us reflect upon ourselves that we're courageous because we're not like Toad. So it gives us a point of departure, a point of comparison. So moving on from characters to story structure, especially with regards to the writer's journey and Hero of 1,000 Faces, which are two really relevant works if you want to dive deeper into writing narrative and looking at narrative structures. While recommended, today we're going to do a brief tour of them in order to just get the general idea, which I think is enough to help you deal with the workshops at hand that we're doing in this course. So the idea behind the Hero with 1,000 Faces is that we're seeing the same heroic structure, the same principles behind the hero, but there are a million varieties to these same stories. And this story structure has a number of different definitions. This is one of them, but they are all in one way or another rather samey, rather similar in their structure. So first off, I should speak about that weird square. This presentation tried to have videos. However, I will, because of technical difficulties, link the videos outside of the lecture so that you can watch them when you hear me say watch the video. So do watch the linked video. It's not the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy. It's just a small snapshot of the first one. So the Vogler's journey structure starts off with an ordinary world, which means that we're placing the listener or player in a setting where they can understand that this is normal, this is how it should be, and then we present the call to adventure. Something is made amiss. Something becomes unbalanced or unjust. The princess, for example, is kidnapped by Bowser, which is in terms of stereotypes and tropes a bit problematic, but we'll get to that later. Where it's a good example of a stereotypical narrative if we stay with that. So then we'll have the refusal of the call. Most heroes will initially be hesitant. They do not want the glory because that would make them sort of glory seekers, and we're not that keen to embrace and find joy in rooting for someone who will too easily accept this adventure or this struggle or conflict. After that, we usually have a meeting with a mentor, with a strong figure who will try and aid or kick the hero in the ass so that the hero starts moving. In the Lord of the Rings example, this is Gandalf, who is appearing again and again throughout the movies or the books to aid the fellowship, and especially perhaps the Hobbit. And then we have a threshold, a point of no return. The example here is from Watership Down, a movie about rabbits. And this road is in the rabbit world. This road marks a threshold, a point that few of them, if any, have ever passed before, because it has these big iron things moving at great speeds across the road. So it's really dangerous to pass the road. So when the small fellowship on their way out on adventure feels that they are forced to cross the road, they are passing this very symbolic threshold. Then we usually have some sort of mix-up. My personal recommendation is to watch really poorly made 80s fantasy movies, because these are generally really, really easy. They are easy to decipher and to deconstruct into these different phases, because they're so overt and they're not, they lack the subtlety that other greater works have. On top of that, they can be quite entertaining as historical documents. Then we move into this phase where you face enemies, allies, and tests that are all usually used in more traditional narrative to again help us relate to and see the hero grow as the hero overcomes these challenges and finds these new allies. In games, this is usually where we find the meat of the game, where we throw the player into a cycle of never-ending dungeons, or have the player confront 1,000 enemies, etc. These are, for example, the many enemies from the first Legend of Zelda game. And then we have a number of points that lead up to the final ordeal, the approach to the innermost cave, that is the hero exploring some dimension of themselves that they weren't aware of existed, and finding their inner strength to finally defeat the ultimate evil. And this ultimate evil in games is usually some kind of boss. And after that we get the reward, the hero returns, and the world is restored again. And balance is restored, and these are recurring themes that we'll also see when we're looking at the dramatic arc. So, to draw a number of conclusions so far, narrative is how you tell a story, as opposed to the sequence of events that are simply the story, but this sequence could be changed, and you would still have the same story, so it's more of a bag of events. We have some relevant characters that are usually pivotal to our story. We have a protagonist, and that could be a hero. An anti-hero is usually some kind of lead character. We usually have an antagonist, someone or something that symbolizes the opposition, the unbalance or injustice. Then we have sidekicks, who are usually used to, in one way or the other, reflect some trait of the hero, or in worst case scenarios just provide an opportunity for dialogue. Another problem that games usually have is that the hero character is usually adventuring on their own, and one of the technical limitations of game development was for a long time, and still is, it's still complicated to have a character tag along without getting stuck on trees or losing itself in an elevator, or simply giving that character correct pathfinding and artificial intelligence, so that that character behaves in a way that makes it anything less than a very stupid hang-along that can also provide you with some interesting dialogue is demanding. It's much simpler to have a silent protagonist who does not talk to anyone and has no friends. Sidekicks, yes. So next, we looked very quickly at the hero's journey and how a regular hero's journey is structured and the common elements therein. So that leads us to next look at the restorative 3-act structure. Aristotle said that all dramas have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So you will see recurring themes from the hero's journey. This is a simpler structure in a sense, although it definitely has a depth of its own, but we're still looking at some kind of setup, a confrontation, and a resolution. and it looks like this. So we're providing, first of all, setting and characters. Then we provide a problem, a disorder or an injustice. And the hero is, for some reason or another, driven across a threshold, a point of no return, where the hero needs to restore order to the world. And this restoring of order, in games, is usually about overcoming increasingly difficult challenges up to a point where we reach a climax. It's perhaps worth mentioning that not all games, of course, do feature this kind of specific 3-act structure, where Tetris, for example, that we used as an example in the game mechanics lecture, does not feature a set dramatic story arc. We can, of course, interpret it as such, that we start off with this very nice empty box, and suddenly it's starting to fill up with these horrible tetrominos, and we are the hero and have to fix this. But it's not designed in that fashion. No one is trying to communicate a narrative to us. The same goes for Candy Crush Saga and puzzle games in general, or games that are very abstract. Or games that are, for example, only for competitive kinds of fun. Multiplayer games, for example, that do not feature a story. They might have story elements, but they do not follow this setup. And this is how most of us are programmed to consume stories. At least in the Western Hemisphere, this has been a very conventional tradition for a very long time, which means that most stories in the West follow this specific pattern. So if we look at, because this is again, of course, a narrative pattern drawn from traditional storytelling. So if we again throw this into the game area, we're probably looking at the rising action part as being that repetitive part after the introduction, where we have to actually complete the game by repeating procedures of increasing difficulty until we reach the final boss, to simplify matters. More likely, though, we're usually looking at a huge arc that in itself contains a number of dramatic arcs. These arcs are usually confined to, for example, levels. We reach the end of a level and we finish that, and that's a small climax, which takes us into the next level, where we again are facing perhaps a different or the same problem, and again we are tasked with taking care of increasingly difficult challenges until we reach the end of that level, etc., until we reach the end of the game. And in traditional storytelling, we do have this pattern in certain TV shows, where, for example, in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the crew goes out to defeat minor issues throughout the season until they start to reach the end, where it ramps up to confrontation with a bigger bad or the big evil of that season, and have to defeat that character, so that there will be order in the town until next season, when a new big bad appears. So as I said at the beginning of this lecture, this structure, along with the hero's journey, along with the different characters, is perceivable in endless amounts of works of fiction. We are not necessarily limited to these kinds of patterns, as we will see. And if we go back to the first example, this is again a traditional linear game story. Event A happens, then event B, then event C. As players, we have no chance of influencing this sequence of events. We might want to be able to do that, though, which is the beauty of games. This is how games differ from traditional forms of media, is that we can take an active participation in how the story should unfold. So this is an example structure known as branching narrative. and even a story as simple as Super Mario Brothers could be perceived as having a branching narrative, even though it definitely I definitely wouldn't call it a good example of such a game. But in this case, we could look at the upper row being the regular course of events, and the lower row being the more likely course of events, which is the princess is kidnapped by Bowser, Mario fights Bowser, and then Mario dies fighting Bowser. Because usually as players we try and try and try again, and then we fail and we get a game over and we have to start over from the beginning, and we do this over and over until we get the desired narrative or story outcome. There are a number of games that use branching narratives to great effect, which is more interesting than you died, start over. For example, allowing the player to make a meaningful decision at a critical point in the story. For example, choose which character should leave the party, or which character to rescue, or if they should defeat this seemingly evil but perhaps not so evil character, etc. And then we have this version of that, which is you could call this some kind of sandbox narrative. For example, in Skyrim, you generally have the Skyrim is part of the Elder Scrolls series by Bethesda, where you start off with the same starting point every time, and then you walk out into the world and you can take part in seemingly endless amount of adventures, some of which poses morality questions and will take your adventure to different parts of the world and have you interact with different characters in different ways. You can in Skyrim you can join the army to help strike down a rebellion, or you can join the rebellion and help strike down the reigning Imperials in these rather huge sort of side tracks to your main quest. But at the end of the day, you're still going to be funneled in toward this end goal, this rather similar end game, regardless of the majority of the content you took part of, and regardless of the choices in the game, you will still, at the end of the day, see the same content. And the reason for doing so is, to a large extent, economic, since branching narratives are very costly. This is, again, another way to visualize an open-ended narrative, where you have event A that sets us off, and in trying to get to C, we'll be able to run into a number of different options. But after having played around in this sandbox, we're still moving to event C. This could be, for example, an open-ended level where we can partake in a number of activities, and the level may play out in different ways. I think one particular point of interest in this case is that we do not necessarily need to choose one of the different ways in which this plays out, but we should be able to, in this case, visit and partake in all these different versions of all of these different events. And then we have this a bit chaotic looking variation where we are truly non-linear, in the sense that the player is able to greatly influence the narrative. And as this illustrates, it's quite difficult to create these kinds of, let's call them emergent narratives. There are many names for narratives that really let's go of control and hands them over to the player. So in this sense, the player is free to explore the narrative at will, and can most likely change the course of events quite dramatically. The issue with this is that someone needs to program the unlikely events as well as the likely events, which costs a lot of money to have someone code things that perhaps only 1% of the player base will see. And it is a bloody hell to bug test, to try and find all the possible interactions that may occur, all the possible interactions, not only between the player but also between the different game elements, to make sure that you made sure that everything works. So again, we have this weird square instead of a video, so please go watch the second video, which is trailer for the game RimWorld, which is a really interesting experiment in trying to communicate an emergent narrative, a narrative that has an artificial intelligence that directs the story. While RimWorld is about you building a colony, there's an artificial intelligence that tries to keep pacing and some kind of dramatic arc in mind when deciding whether or not today should be the day that the colony gets a supply package from outer space, or whether today should be the day that a new horde of squirrels run past the colony, or if murderous barbarians are coming to defeat you. So in this case, we have a director programmed to sense what's happening in the game and how you're doing, to listen to the game systems in order to drive the narrative forward. So this system has the advantage of usually being a bit cheaper than branching narratives, but on the other hand, these kinds of game systems are difficult to control. As I said, it's costly to bug test, it's costly to program for all possible outcomes. So as an example, I worked for a couple of years on a game called Prom Queen. And in Prom Queen, where you play a girl in high school, just moved to a new town, you're trying to become the Prom Queen, and you have 1 year to do so. It's the last year of high school. And in order to do so, you need to be rather ruthless. You try to become popular by bullying, backstabbing, by starving yourself so you're fitting into the best dresses, you're dealing drugs, you're going to house parties and try and get yourself one of the most popular boyfriends in order for his popularity to stick on you, etc. So that's a satirical kind of role-playing game in a rather different setting. What we did there was try and give 21 different non-player characters. Most of these are our classmates. We gave them massive amount of attributes which would control different kinds of interactions between them and you, and between them and each other. So these characters have popularity, they have preferences for style, music, whether or not they're doing drugs, whether or not they own a dark secret that no one must know about, which other characters they really like, which characters they dislike. And then we have a system that for each day and each week throughout the year will influence how these characters relate to each other and to the player. So that's another way of exemplifying how game systems can be used to influence the narrative. The narrative stays the same in that in most cases, unless the player dies throughout the high school year, the player will arrive at the end of the year at the prom and will then get an ending based on their results. But the journey every time will be quite different because these character traits are quickly spiraling out of control. It was definitely difficult to test. So next up, we're going to talk about drama.